Welcome to The Foundry, where leaders are forged daily. And now your host, George Roberts.
Welcome back, entrepreneurs. Today we have David Cruz-Palmer, founder of Corridor Capital Partners. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, I'm really excited to talk to you today because your experience really runs the entire gambit. You've got triple net experience, both as a broker, you are an investor as well. And I think you'll want to listen to the end because we're also going to be talking about some macroeconomics and mindset tips. So let's get started by just giving you an opportunity to take us through your real estate journey in some broad brushstrokes. Tell us how you got started and where you ended up.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Really excited to be here. I guess the odyssey of my real estate career really started as what's called a tenant rep, commercial real estate broker in San Francisco about 15 years ago. What that means is I helped companies, nonprofits, just anyone who was needed to find and negotiate for commercial space in San Francisco, really anywhere in the world, and set up real estate plans, strategies, execute those strategies, and kind of evaluate markets and analyze rents, figure out, and then negotiate actual transactions. So usually it's just the business terms, and then there's a lease that comes after the business terms. So it's been about 15 years doing that with, as you can imagine, in San Francisco from 2007 to a little after 2020, lots of tech companies, lots of Fortune 500s, and some really large tech companies, and also some early stage startups that I got to ride from 2 founders all the way up to hundreds of employees with multiple locations. And that was a really fun ride, and it was great. And then COVID kind of happened, so I actually had a couple of really big years going right before COVID and then after COVID. And the funny thing about being a commercial real estate broker is you kind of always either have in the back of your mind, or maybe in the forefront of your mind, that you want to own commercial real estate, because that's a thing you do. For some reason, lots of brokers don't, and sometimes they invest, and for no reason that I can even figure out, all commercial real estate brokers who have any kind of extra money should be, all real estate professionals should be investing in real estate, because there's some tax advantages that just benefit them probably more than any other industry. But I always said I wanted to do it, had some time to figure out what it meant to syndicate real estate properties, wanted to buy something big and didn't quite have enough money to buy something huge. And so about 6 months to a year, just podcasts, researching, talking to everyone, figuring out how do you put this thing together. Didn't know anything about syndication or really investment, and kind of an embarrassingly limited amount of knowledge about owning, operating, and investing in real estate. But I've learned a lot. There's a ton of resources out there for anyone who wants to get into this. There's really no shortage of it, and no shortage of experts out there, like actual experts, that are readily available. And then so I put together a couple of investments with friends and family, mostly a couple of institutional family office groups, and a lot of directions and a lot of learning and growing my business since then. But after I got those first 2, those are my, that's where I got my feet on the ground, got my stability. And since then I've been trying to find more properties and just figure out ways to really create leverage points and scale, so that all the effort that I put into the work and earn on my time and my the investment that I put in for myself and my investors.
Well, first of all, thank you for the classical reference. The Odyssey has got to be one of the greatest works of literature of all time. Another thing I'd like to draw out, though, is, you said that the dream is to own investment properties. And on the face of it, I would agree, right? It seems like, well, you're a broker, you understand all about real estate, and why wouldn't you want to invest? But I have to admit, I wouldn't know the first thing about being a broker. So maybe there's more to it and getting over that hump.
Yeah, no, that's right. And what's really interesting is the majority of investments that are available and kind of out there right now, I feel like those are multi-family investments, right? Everyone's paid rent or paid a mortgage, presumably in their life, or they certainly understand how that works. You got insurance and taxes. We all know how taxes work. Just to some extent, they have to be paid, right? And utilities. And so I think there's a lot of information available, a lot of opportunities available, and a lot of people who are evangelizing investing in multifamily. in residential and fix and flips and wholesaling, right? All these concepts. Not so many people are doing commercial, and I think about it a lot, and I kind of wonder why. I think the reason is because when there's a commercial property, there's a commercial lease, right? And so we don't really have experience negotiating against, if you buy a cash flowing asset, you could have a mom and pop, like a 7-Eleven in there. You could have a hardware store. You could have a Fortune 500 industrial logistics center user, right? You could use the whole gamut. And so reading a lease is a little bit of a daunting task, but the reality is there's a broker that understands it. And in every city in America, there's probably an attorney that specializes in real estate, or one that could at least help you get through it. But I do think there's a little bit of a mental block, or maybe just a lack of confidence and willingness to just take the jump and buy a commercial property versus multifamily, because we just understand housing and residential properties a lot more.
Yeah, so true. Well, hopefully this podcast will help get some brokers into the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, as you mentioned,
or get some other people investing in commercial
Yeah.
properties, right outside of multifamily and residential.
Well, exactly. I know a lot of our listeners are in the multifamily syndication space, so I always like to open it up. I feel like it's quite possible that we're going to be vastly overcrowded in multifamily soon, and so I'm certainly looking to get into industrial and some other sectors.
Yeah, and I'm long on industrial for all kinds of reasons, and the reason I did industrial is because I'm just comfortable with commercial leases. I've negotiated with commercial tenants for, and landlords for years. So that's normal. I can read a 100-page lease and kind of just like find the things that I need. It's second nature. I've actually have a little primer that I put together on the highlights and the things that you should be looking at when you read through a commercial lease. I'm happy to share that with you and your listeners. Just the things that are important, because I feel like that really is the hurdle, right? If it's multifamily, honestly, I think multifamily, the due diligence that you have to put into up front for a multifamily and the assumptions that you have to make on, man, if you had just what debt's going to be after you do your after resale value, and what the construction costs are going to be, and you really have to learn a lot about the market, construction costs, the timing, the vendors, and after resale values, and make some like pretty big assumptions. For a commercial space, you're not necessarily, your value add isn't to flip it. It isn't to renovate it and reposition it. It can be, it sure can be. But most of the time you've got a lease, or you've got some leases, or you don't have any leases, right? And then what do? No lease, let's get a tenant, right? Buy it at a good price, below market, get a tenant. If you have leases, then you figure out what they are and you do it. It's a pretty simple cash flow. You can make it complicated, but the cash flow is pretty simple because it's spelled out. This is what their rent is. This is what the annual escalation is. This is when the lease started. This is when it ends. And then you figure out where that is relative to market, and that's your value add. In a lot of cases, like that's your value. If they're paying $4 a foot, market's $5 a foot, and their lease expires in 2 years, it's pretty easy to figure out what your NOI is going to be and what that's going to do, assuming a similar cap rate, right? So you can do a cash out refi once you readjust the lease, and then you just have to make sure that you understand what the tenant is actually, what their options are. Can they leave? Do they need the rail that serves it? Is there another rail across town? Can they use that one, or is the next one 60 miles away, right? So
let's start with your tips. So you said you got a resource. Where can our listeners find that?
Yeah, that'll be on my website, Corridor Capital Partners.
Okay,
I'll post it on. I'll send it to you, and then I can also I'm going to put it on LinkedIn pretty soon. That
sounds like a great thing to have.
Yeah, totally.
Because I know there are a lot of people who are going into, say, retail, for example, and they may not be like the Fortune 500 companies that you've worked with. Maybe they can't afford a great tenant rep broker, but to be able to read through something like that and get some ideas, just to know what to ask your lawyer when you look at those leases. They are pretty thick, and it's a lot of things are put obviously on the tenant in the triple net space. That's the idea.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting when you talk to someone who owns a property about buying it, and you say, "Is this triple net lease? Is it, or what is it?" And everyone, there are different definitions for triple net. It's strange.
Yes.
There's an absolute triple net. There's a regular triple net, and then sometimes you have there's a property I was looking at, and I have an offer out on that I'm negotiating on, and the guy thought it was triple net, but he's not passing insurance along to the tenants because he has this umbrella insurance policy for all of his properties, and he didn't want to spend the time to figure out how to send a pro rata share of that to his tenants. And so, I mean, that's fine. It's fine with me.
Right.
I haven't seen all of the leases, but if any of them say that it's a triple net lease and he just hasn't been charging that to them, and then I buy the property, I mean, that's another line item that adds value to me based on a contractual obligation to the commercial tenant, right?
Right. Yeah. Best advice I've ever gotten with triple net is when you ask the question, who pays for something? Read the lease.
Yeah, sure. Right. And that's easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a much more, I say that it's easy, but there are things you can do. You can actually hire a company. It's probably around $500 at the minimum. I know there was one that used to do $350 to do a lease abstract. And what they'll do is read the lease for you. They'll guarantee like 99 point some percent accuracy, and they'll turn it around in about a week. And they'll abstract every single term in the lease, even if it's, there was a lease signed 30 years ago. It was a 10-year lease, and they've done 5-year lease amendments ever since. They'll line item every single thing, every single expense throughout history, and that will give you in like high level terms, like easily readable terms, without so much a lot of legal language. That'll tell you what the options are for the tenant, what the expenses are, who pays for what. There's a section that says operating expenses, and it lists out what the operating expense exclusions are, even in a triple net lease, right?
Yeah.
So, is it just the roof? Is it just the foundation and the
Right.
parking lot that the landlord pays? Absolute triple net lease, the tenant pays everything.
Yes.
It's nuts. So those rents are typically a little lower, but in a really strong market, it actually isn't proportionate to the cost. It's a disproportionate difference between what the cost is that passed along to the tenant versus the market value. So there's a little bit of, I don't know that anyone's going to go out and create a whole fund to arbitrage absolute triple net leases, but there's definitely some upside there.
Yeah, that's huge. As you mentioned, many different types of triple net leases, and each one is really its own animal. You mentioned a case of something that was not in the triple net lease, namely the insurance, so not truly a triple net. Is there anything else that you've seen over the years that was either that was odd or excluded, and you were surprised to see that it wasn't there?
No, not off the top of my head. I think it's a matter of definitions and expectations, right? There's so many different expectations, and no one really says double net. I guess maybe they say single net. But what I will say that's important is, figuring out what's market. If you're looking at a property and trying to look for upside, frequently converting to triple net, or what I call a triple net conversion, is a really valuable play. If there's a property that is in a market that has a very little vacancy, and no tenant or a lease that's expiring, you can put a new lease in front of the tenant. Say, hey, new ownership, got a new lease. This is how we do it. You can adjust the rent so it looks the same as what they were paying before, even including, so maybe they were paying $15 a square foot. You drop it down to 12, and then the $3 is now triple net. But what you're doing, even if you're breaking even, or maybe you charge 3 or 5% more, what you're doing is you've got these inflationary pressures, right? Insurance is always going up, right? I don't think insurance has ever gone down since it was invented, right? So you're putting that onto the tenant. That's a increasing operating expense. So if you're looking at a building that has a gross lease means that the landlord pays everything, passes it through to the tenant, or there's a base year where the tenant has escalations based on their pro rata share of the tenancy. So you could have a gross lease that does that. Then you shift the gross lease to triple net. Maybe they pay the same rent that they paid the year before, but the increases, right? So inflation can increase the cost of labor. So you've got a property manager, maybe a facilities manager, maybe their wages go up. Just the cost of goods and services goes up. Vendors are more expensive, just doing plumbing, electrical, that kind of stuff. Insurance and taxes. So you buy this building, and then now the tenant has a new lease, and then the increase in taxes gets passed through to them. So one, it's just a way to deflect expenses, but two, I think that's even more valuable during these uncertain inflationary times, right? We say buy real estate during a recession because the debt's fixed, or it's a good stable income. But there are other things you can do to sort of juice your returns and make it an even better investment.
Right. Well, you mentioned the gross to triple net play. That might be
Yeah,
one of my favorite
for the
value adds
conversion.
with triple net.
Yeah.
Uh, any other great value plays that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big one. There's something that's more common in multifamily or maybe even single family, which is getting some amount of seller financing, right? So if you buy a property, this isn't a secret, right? You can get seller financing, it's all negotiables. I'm in contract on a big property that is 100, well, we're putting 25% down, so it's 75% 70 seller finance. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other is all the offers I'm putting out right now, because rates are going up, and I don't know where they're going to, I think they're 6.5 today, and they'll probably be 7 in a month, right? And they could keep going up, who knows? But the argument that I use when I put an offer in on a new property now is, hey, I need to get some amount of seller financing. You still want to get the price that you wanted. I don't know that I can get exactly that price, but I can get close. And my costs for debt has doubled, right? Well, the interest rates have doubled in the last year, from call it 3.5% to 7%. What a lot of people don't actually talk about, though. So one reason to invest in real estate is tax advantages, right? So with 100% bonus depreciation going away this year and drop down to 80% next year, you think about equity multiples as it relates to the amount of money that you put down, right? So if you put 10% down versus 25% down to get the same amount of returns, that's a pretty remarkable difference in returns when you're putting so much less money down. But no one talks about if you put 10% down and then you've got, say, $1 million in bonus depreciation, you could put 25% down and get $1 million, or you could put 10% down and get $1 million in bonus depreciation. I feel like that's like a really under explored concept that I'm really focusing on, because plenty of people are still making money. One, you can stockpile your depreciation for up to 23 years, right? Or you just have a lot of capital gains that you need to defer. So people still have cap gains, they're still selling businesses, there's still a lot of money out there. And the investors that I'm working with on some of the properties right now really need as much bonus depreciation as they can get. So the offers that I'm putting in, so for these people in particular who are investing in my properties, we're trying to get as little money down to get the most bonus depreciation we can. And then obviously it still needs to be a good real estate deal.
Yeah, I love it. Great advice there. And remember, triple net doesn't mean that you can't do value add, right? It's not like multifamily where you can renovate half the units or 25% a year or whatever you do, but there's still a lot of value add plays. So love it, love it, love it. I feel like a lot of people are going to be going into these maybe currently less crowded phases of real estate. So good stuff there. Now, what about your personal investing? So it looks like currently you're looking at industrial and flex retail.
Yeah, flex warehouse. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
That's okay. No, I'm a little scared of retail. I don't totally get it. I haven't done a lot of retail deals. I know that there's upside. I know it makes sense. I just really I like things with roll-up doors.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason is because there's a 3% vacancy rate on roll-up door space, right? Big logistics centers, industrial warehouses. And then even honestly, these little flex warehouses, which are, if you're driving down the street and your contractor has a place where he stores his stuff, he's got a roll-up door and he's got a couple thousand square feet. Those rents are really low. And in most markets, there's not enough of that. A lot of it has to do with like historical NIMBYism, right? So when all of our neighborhoods started getting developed in 1945, right after World War II, there wasn't a lot of thought put into where do we put this industrial stuff. So you can kind of like, if you do an aerial of your town or any city and try and figure out like what was the logic for where the industrial is, it's usually in an awkward spot, and it's not the kind of industrial space that we use now, right? Like big box and high ceiling industrial, like Amazon warehouses or things like that. But there's so much value in having those. In my town, there's a 1% vacancy rate, and there has been even before kind of like everything that's happening with logistics centers. But for anything with a roll-up door, there's been a 1% vacancy rate for decades, and that is sort of for a NIMBY, like not in my backyard type type mentality where people say, we don't want this in the middle of our lovely little town. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a lovely little town. And we don't want this right next to our houses, right? We don't want it to depreciate the value of our homes. So like that can go over there. And if it tries to spread out, we're not okay with that. And then it's limited where it can go outside of that, right? So then you got to drive 15, 20 minutes outside of a town to an area that hasn't really been developed. And so it's just a decreasing supply of space because there's usually more value in housing. So getting some of that stuff is amazing, especially since there's a limited supply. You can convert those to triple net. I know that there are a lot of institutional investors actually looking for that type of asset, right? Because you can treat it sort of like the leases are short; they're 1 to 3 year leases, and you can extend them for longer if you want. And the rents are typically low because some guys own them for 30 years or whatever, right? And he just wants to have 100% occupancy rate and doesn't want to deal with vacancy, and so he just keeps rents low and he knows everybody. So I'm not saying you need to like get in there and put the screws to everyone, but there's easily 10 to 20% upside in most of these. And that's readily available because that space is really competed for because there isn't much of it.
Right, yeah, I love it. It's a great play, just like the mobile home parks. A lot of times you can't, it's not easy to construct new ones. So increasing demand.
It's like a mix of mobile homes and self-storage, right? Because self-storage is sort of that same concept where you just crank up the rent 5 or 10% because someone was asleep at the wheel. It's both of those. Yeah.
Oh yeah, people never want to lose their stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. You pay more rent than the value of the stuff inside, but they don't want to let go.
Yeah, that's right.
They'll pay rent on that forever. Okay, so then
and the cost to move is worse than the increase too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, speaking about that cost to move, so certain things, another thing that's not being built now, but which is very valuable would be rail serve, right? So yeah, when you have something with rail serve, you want to go into that a little bit and tell us about why that's such a great play.
Yeah, I mean, so there are certain companies that just absolutely need rail. The US is, we've built a bunch of rail for a long time, and now there's a real shortage. There's an infrastructure bill, right, that I think was just passed, but we're trying to increase the amount of rail that exists. But if there's a property that has an active rail spur and there's a tenant that's paying rent and using that rail spur,
right,
the chances are they have absolutely nowhere to go.
Right.
I know of a building that has a tenant in it. It's a Fortune 500 publicly traded, billions of dollar market cap company. They're in this large building. They use it for rail to ship in a really heavy product. That their assumptions were that they needed rail because gas was too expensive in 2016. Can you imagine like how justified they are in needing rail now, right? And so I mean, you could even build that into your analysis and say like, what are their options, right? So that's like a tenant relocation scenario, right? You say, what are the options? What are the costs to move? And what are the costs if you do move? So if this company moved to the nearest rail served location, they'd have to go 40 miles. So they have another facility across town where they do production. So they rail in the heavy thing, they do production a couple miles away, and then they finish the product, move it back to the warehouse where they store it and ship it out. And so they need this rail because they only ship things a couple miles. But if you had to ship, 30,000 pounds a couple times a day on a truck, 40 miles, and then make the product and then ship it back to another warehouse, like that's unsustainable. That eats into your margins, and publicly traded companies are fighting really hard to keep their revenues up right now, right? So
talk about a captive tenant, huh? That's
exactly right. That's exactly the word.
Difficult situation.
Yeah, and in that building they're paying 30% below market on a gross lease.
Right.
So they're not going anywhere.
Yeah. So industrial, I think, is a very amazing topic with Amazon and other e-tailers growing this sort of warehouse space or logistics center space, however you want to call it, is without a doubt, it's under strain, and it takes time to develop. A lot of NIMBYism, right? I'm sure you're not going to put those centers as close as Amazon might like them to the population centers in many cases, or at least new ones. Maybe again, you did mention a lot of listeners are out there in multifamily land. would probably like a primer on industrial. Do you want to give us a quick rundown on what is industrial versus multifamily in terms of acquiring the properties, running them, etc.?
Yeah, if you don't, maybe I'll start with saying sort of why industrial to some
Yeah.
extent. You can drop a pin in the map pretty much anywhere in the country, and there's a 3% vacancy rate for industrial space. So some are lower, some are a little bit higher, but pretty much any place you can drop a pin, there's a 3% vacancy rate, and that is a really tight market. 10% vacancy rate, and so vacancy rate is a metric that real estate brokers and investors use to figure out like what's the rate, what percentage space is vacant relative to the market. So that just means that it's a very tight market and undersupplied, and that tenants don't have a lot of other options. And so much of investing and negotiating leases is, where's the leverage and what can you get? And so there's a lot of leverage for an investor or landlord with a 3% vacancy rate. You've got Amazons out there, you've got other tenants still looking at space. People talk about Amazon and how they're giving 41 spaces, putting 40 some spaces back on the market for sublease, or just walking away from their contracts, which is funny to me. It's like saying that Amazon's the canary in the coal mine, right? They're not. It's Amazon, right? So what happened was Amazon took 25 years to build a portfolio of leased warehouses of 193 million square feet. And it took, in 2 years after they built that, they doubled it to 387 million square feet. So it's just crazy. What actually happened is they grew really fast, and then they grew way faster. And at the same time, they were putting robots. They're doing R&D, and they've got robots that are doing things that people were doing. And so their assumptions for finding new space started around 2015, 2016. And when they developed a space plan so that they could have like an iterable plan that they built space off of. So it's a certain number of acres, certain number of people. You move to a town that has the right demographics for employee labor and affordable real estate land. You find a developer partner, and then you want to be really close to a highway, right? And you need a certain amount of parking for these people, and then you need a certain square footage to do whatever the operations are. So all that happened, robots came, and then you need less people. It's not significantly less, but even a 30% drop in humans means that the whole program has changed. So their most recent facility is 4.1 million square feet. It's in Ontario, California. It's 94 acres. It's 5 stories tall. It's 94 football fields, 5 times stacked on each other, right? And I say 4.1 million square feet. That's square feet, right? That's linear. That's on one plane.
Right.
5 stories. We're not talking about leasing volume, right?
Right.
Imagine a robot dropping down from up high and straight down. But if you laid that out 5 times, just the 4.1 million square feet alone is 94 acres, and it would hold all of Disney's California Adventure theme parks with 21 acres to spare.
Yeah, amazing.
And that's just one of the stories laid out flat, right?
It's these robots are really changing real estate. It's pretty amazing how high you can go.
So all that to say, I like industrial because there's an extreme shortage of space. And so, when you're looking, it's not just any industrial building, right? It's never a gross assumption on a market. You can find markets and make good assumptions, but it really comes down to like each individual building. What's the story there? What's that tenant doing? How long's their lease? What are the opportunities for value add or for restructuring the leases? And is it a short term or is it long term? And also with a 3% vacancy rate and with interest rates climbing, there's really not a lot of development. So normally the response that the market has is to build more stuff when there's a low interest rate or a low vacancy rate, and year over year 20% growth in rents for years running, right? So the market's response is build more, but we're in this weird time where there's not a lot of spec development. There's almost no spec development right now. The only spec development is stuff that was being built previously or in really strong growing markets like Savannah or Central California.
So why is that then? Because obviously we have a little parallel to maybe residential. We've got some extraordinary profits, but it seems hard to draw people in. So is it just the construction industry in general is maybe a little jittery after 2008.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think construction is constrained right now, right? It's unpredictable. It's a supply chain issue, right?
Yeah.
You don't know how long it's going to take to get the stuff, right? I have friends who are building a house and they wanted to buy 2 Bosch dishwashers, and for them, they had, they switched to a KitchenAid, right? Because it was like a year wait list for a Bosch. I mean, that's for residential, and it's the same thing for commercial, right? There's been a backlog of steel, and now there's talks of Chinese largest steel manufacturer is going to file bankruptcy, and China's pivoting right now to try to figure out how do we subsidize them and keep them in business. I mean, the war, right? So Amazon had contracts. They anticipated their hypergrowth years ago, and so they locked up contracts for something like 50% of the world's steel for the next 5 years. So there may be a couple years running for that. But at the same time, China's not growing any slower, right? Their growth rate has been something like 5% per year for a while, and so they have a massive appetite. It's also interesting to think about, China. Maybe this is the macro stuff, but what's going on with China from a population growth perspective, and they're going to get passed by India in 2025. But the whole reason that happened is because they went through this extreme. I don't know. They became an industrialized country over the course of 1 or maybe 2 generations, which is really unprecedented. I think Britain was, over 12 generations, and the U.S. was something like 7 generations, and China's 1 or 2. And so you've got these people that live in abject poverty. A billion people live in rice fields, living day to day, hand to mouth, and they have kids because kids are free labor, right? When you're out in a rice field. And then these companies come in. We had, in the 1980s, we had a lot of, really since World War II, but there were a couple of decades after World War II where there were federal government had policies that increased trade and encouraged companies to go overseas. And also capitalism is a beast, right? It's a consuming beast that needs cheap labor and cheap land and cheap infrastructure, right? And so you go to China and you set up shop, and you have jobs and you have employment, and people move with their 10 kids, and the kids go from being cheap labor to like really, really expensive. It's just really expensive to have kids in a big city when you have 10 of them. People say, was it really expensive pets, I think is the bad joke. So, they've industrialized, they start to make money, and now they've got a middle class. And so with the middle class, you want like meat and grain and things built of steel. And so China's now a consumer, and there's a concept called decoupling. It's part of like this deglobalization concept. So what it is the US is the major economy and China is the other major economy, right? So the US and companies in China that are US based are trying to figure out, or even Apple, right? So Apple uses Foxconn to make iPhones, right? Billions of square feet. And the majority of that is all made in China. And then you've got Xi and a zero COVID policy, and shut down the country for 6 months unannounced, and just like, we're not going to have COVID and we're going to shut it all down. And Apple doesn't like that, and they're not the only ones, right? So what are you going to do? Are you going to have a really unpredictable production supply chain? Right? Like, was it Steve Jobs' daughter tweeted about having the Apple iPhone 14 and how she thought it was kind of boring and just like the 13? I don't know. I don't really know. Like, I heard about that. I don't really know who she is or follow anything, but you got to imagine Apple heard about that too. And so then they say, okay, well, let's get the 15 out. But China's been shut down for, I don't know, was it 9 months this year? In the last 24 months? It's amazing.
Right.
So,
and just affecting the ports as well, right? The whole supply
100%.
chain is impacted, not just because it's not being produced, but if they shut down a port for a few days, all of the logistics, all of the planning goes out the window.
Yeah, they produce 20% of the world's goods. 20% of the world's goods. That's amazing.
It is.
And to shut it down, and then we say, well, where's everything? So then everything costs more because there isn't enough of it. And then you get too much of it, and then you need more warehouse space to store it. So everyone starts stockpiling, and it's just like this weird. And
so invest in industrial. Is that your conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, deglobalization, 100%. So I mean, think about the companies that were in China, not just Apple, right? The other ones that had production manufacturing facilities, or even in any other country, right? Because now you've got ports to your point, right? You just jumped ahead on the point. Mm-hmm. So it's the ports from not just China, but anywhere, and you've got a backlog, and all of these there aren't that many major ports in the US. And so you got a backlog, or it takes longer because, LA port, which is I think the biggest, is too busy. There's too long a wait. So then you go around, and I think last month, New York was the largest port. It had more containers shipped into it than any other port in the first time in like 50 years or something like that. Because everyone else was too backed up. And it's just fascinating, right? And so really anywhere that you can get industrial, companies are moving back to the US, some faster than others, establishing a presence. So even if there is a boom in construction, and even if Amazon puts some spaces back on the market, it really looks and feels like there isn't going to be nearly enough industrial space for years and years to come.
Yeah, excellent points. And I know a lot of those containers, they go to Jacksonville if they can make it in, but obviously nowhere near as big as New York City. It's just crazy, the logistical nightmare that's been brought to us through COVID. A lot of things going on. I don't know if there's some other things you might want to talk about, but you did mention some demographics. So China may be one of the places that's not doing so well from an age structure standpoint, but some other places in the world maybe have a rosier picture.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think China's growth rate is something like 1.15 individuals per family, which is sort of unsustainable. Russia's also had a really hard time with population growth. It's funny, you think about like, what do you do? This doesn't answer your question, but it's kind of funny to think about. So Russia's solution to this was in the early 2000s, and I think we all kind of heard about how there were a lot of like Russian orphans for adoption, and Russia said, we'll pay you women to have more babies. And they said, great, here's your baby, here's my check. Here's my check, here's your baby. And so there was a problem with Russian orphans. And so that's part of why they have this, you hear about so many people going over to Russia and adopting kids. But yeah, there are other countries. So the US is actually doing really well from a population growth rate perspective. The US is, Mexico is, Argentina is, and Argentina is always just this really fascinating country, right? They've been projected to be a world power sort of on and off for the last 100 years. And they have amazing resources and amazing culture. And I mean, Buenos Aires is one of my favorite cities I've ever been to.
It's home of tango, so they've certainly made some great contributions to the
tango,
world.
red meat, and great red wine too. Among
I
other
was
things.
going to mention that. I was wondering if you
meal.
would mention it first.
Yeah.
But I do like Argentinian wine, Malbec, etc. Yeah, South American wine can be great. Yeah, I don't know. They may have had a little pause, as you mentioned, on and off. They've been predicted to be very rich. They kind of had some flirtations with some other political systems that
hasn't really helped there. And in the inflation problem, it's funny to look at
terrible.
inflation, you see how practiced they are at it. And so Argentina, New Zealand, US, Mexico, I think all of Africa is doing pretty well, and France. Those are the top countries are doing pretty well from a population growth perspective. And so if you extrapolate that out, I don't know how this really affects my current real estate, industrial real estate hypothesis, but by around mid 2030, China's going to have a real problem. They're not going to have enough people to to increase productivity from like a GDP perspective. So their GDP will go down, and there's not much they can do about it right now. We'll see what happens with advances in AI and all this other stuff, but or maybe they're just cloning humans. Who knows? If anyone's able to do that, it's not able and willing.
Yeah, I love it. Well, thank you for giving us that macroeconomic rundown and tying it back to real estate. I think that's extraordinarily important, particularly in a time of turmoil such as this. I think that all of you better operators are going to be doing that.
Yeah, I agree.
Good stuff. Well, I tell you what, I don't want to wrap this up because I've been having a real good time here, but I think we have to wrap it up. So maybe we'll head into our lightning round. You ready?
As much as I'll ever be.
Okay, David. All right. So tell us something about one of your real estate markets that most people wouldn't know.
That's a great question. So the area that I like the most is actually the Interstate 81 corridor. That's the most famous corridor. It's most famously in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, but in Virginia, it crosses from my hometown of Winchester all the way down to through Southwest Virginia. And it's this really hot little pocket where just not a lot of supply and extreme vacancy. And if you can get a built like a warehouse anywhere along 81, that would be a really great play. Feeds into Tennessee. Yeah.
I love it. I love it hearing about new places and things that are not maybe yet on the radar. So some fabulous intel there. What's some advice you'd have for your younger self?
Yeah, great question. Don't be scared to just go. Shut your eyes and jump if you need to.
Beautiful. What is the best real estate advice you've ever received?
Couple things. Bite off more than you can chew and chew like crazy. And then well, I think frequently about, well, I feel frequently because I'm still building my business out, kind of trying to do it really, really quickly and really well at the same time. But I'm building the airplane while flying it. That's how it feels. Constantly.
Awesome. Good stuff. I love that. Bite off more than you can chew and then chew like crazy. Now, I would say that real estate is also full of bad advice. What's the worst advice you've heard going around?
What is that? It's if you have a good deal, the investors will come. And also there's a lot of corny mindset stuff out there. I'm really big into mindset. I actually believe in it, but just belief isn't enough. You need to have some actionable plans too, and really understand where you're trying to go, what you want.
I love it. So true. Maybe we'll find out how corny some of that mindset stuff is as the market turns.
Well said. I think there will be some fallout, or maybe just some really people with great perspective, but not a lot of success.
Yeah, well, I could have it backwards. Perhaps we'll have ever more need for mindset at that point. All right, how about this? Let's take a nod to the randomness in the universe and let me know when you want me to stop cutting the random question deck.
Love it. And stop.
All right, top card. Oh, I don't think I've asked this one before. In what era would you have liked to have grown up?
Oh, that's funny. Two things. One, I do CrossFit and we have a question of the day. And today's question was, what would the question be if you woke up 100 years from now, if you were cryogenically frozen? So this is funny because I would actually go back about 100 years. When I in college, I majored in history, and I just always had this fascination with the industrial boom, industrialization of the United States, kind of like post right after the Civil War. So I think it would be, between 1900 and 1910, just as this heydays cresting. And you've got tax codes being contemplated and written, and it just this really fascinating time with industrialization in the United States in particular. Really great stuff.
Yeah, exciting choice. I love it. Couldn't have predicted it. Can you name a book that has helped to forge you as a leader and as an entrepreneur?
So definitely a mindset. Back to the mindset. I'm a big believer in Think and Grow Rich.
Yeah,
I think there's real value in it. It's I don't know. I think if you can figure out what he's trying to say and how he's trying to say it, I think there's real value in. I think there's a lack of understanding in how the subconscious mind works, and I think that that's what these mindset people today are talking a lot about. But if you need to do something that's outside of your expectations of self, there's a reason that you only limit your beliefs, and that's why limiting beliefs exist, right? Is that you have a routine, you have a path, you're on a trail, and straying from it is straying from people's expectations and perception of you and your own perception and expectations of yourself. And so if you can find a way to kind of get in your mind and tell yourself to try a little harder or to do something that you're otherwise scared of, I think there's so much value in that. And I got a lot of that from reading Think and Grow Rich. I probably read it 6 times at this point.
love it. I think that's a good number. A classic book like that is definitely worth 5 or 6 reads.
Yeah.
How does a failure or misstep set you up for later success?
Yeah. I think it's funny. I feel like I'm always growing, right? Constantly. I feel like I've done the most growth in the last couple of years that I probably ever have because it was really intentional. And I think before that, I've been maybe skating along or not trying really hard. And I think that, perfectionism is the thing that we all probably struggle and deal with. It's a crutch, but sometimes you need to kind of jump and try to not be a perfectionist, see where you land, and then figure it out from there. So, was a broker. I was a fine broker, but I wasn't a great broker. but I wanted to work with great brokers. And you just have these, like I said, it's back to the limiting beliefs and where you think you are, but high expectation of self. And I don't know if it's a misstep. I think it's all led me to where I am, but having taken a jump and invested in myself and changed my belief in myself, man, I'm night and day from who I was a couple years ago.
Love it. I love that growth mindset. Can you start us out with a quote to help forge our listeners as leaders and entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So I like Tim Ferriss a lot, and he asks this question when he gets stuck. He says, how would this look if it were easy? And I asked that to myself a few times. It's like when you're stuck and something's really hard, sometimes you say, what if this was easy? And it just really changes the perspective, and it makes it digestible and I think really more fun instead of hard.
Yeah, I love the perspective. I wish we would have had more time to delve into the mindset stuff, but who knows, maybe that'll be the grounds for a second interview.
Round two.
But really appreciated this interview. I learned so much today, and I hope our listeners did as well. Just want to make sure that everybody knows where they can reach you.
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. It's David Cruz-Palmer, and you can email me, david@corridorcapitalpartners.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, George.